This $2 million mistake is on you. That sentence landed in the conference room like a brick through glass. 14 people were sitting around the long, polished table inside North River Logistics Finance conference room. Laptops open. Quarterly reports displayed on the screen. Coffee cups half empty. And suddenly every head in the room turned toward one person. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Elena Ramirez, 32 years old, senior financial analyst, known inside the company for something very simple. Her numbers were never wrong. But right now, her boss was pointing straight at her. David Whitmore, 47, vice president of finance, stood near the projector screen with a printed report in his hand. His voice was loud enough that people in the hallway could probably hear it. This $2 million mistake, he repeated slowly, tapping the report with his finger, is on you. The words hung in the air. You could feel the shift in the room instantly. The subtle discomfort. The quiet relief that spreads when everyone realizes the blame has landed on someone else. A few people looked down at their laptops. Others stared directly at Elena. And one person across the table, Sam Patel, a 29-year-old data analyst, looked completely stunned. Because everyone in that room knew Elena's reputation. She was the person people went to when numbers didn't make sense. She was the person who caught small mistakes before they became big ones. And now she was apparently responsible for losing the company $2 million. Let that sink in for a second. $2 million. Not 2,000. Not 20,000. 2 million. In a logistics company like North River, that kind of mistake could erase an entire quarter's profit. People lose jobs over numbers like that. Careers end over numbers like that. So here's the question. What would you do if your boss blamed you for a $2 million mistake in front of everyone? Would you defend yourself immediately? Would you argue? Would you pull up the data and prove him wrong right there? Most people would. But Elena didn't. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't interrupt. She didn't even look angry. She simply nodded once and said 2 words. Understood. That was it. No explanation. No defense. Just calm acceptance. If you were sitting in that meeting, you probably would have thought the same thing everyone else did. She must have made the mistake. Because why else would someone accept blame like that? But here's the part no one in that room knew yet. At that exact moment, Elena already had something open on her laptop. An email. Not just any email. An email thread from 3 weeks earlier. And inside that thread was a message that would completely change the story. But before we get there, you need to understand the situation they were dealing with. North River Logistics wasn't a tiny startup. It was a regional shipping company generating nearly $600 million a year in revenue. Hundreds of employees. Dozens of major transportation contracts. And Elena's job was to analyze the financial models behind those contracts. Fuel costs. Driver availability. Route efficiency. Vendor pricing structures. Her spreadsheets determined whether deals saved the company money or quietly drained it. Which brings us to the deal that caused this entire explosion. A trucking vendor contract. Originally projected to save the company about $1.3 million a year. But according to the report currently on the projector screen, the deal was now projected to lose $2 million. That's a swing of over $3 million. And according to David Whitmore, Elena's analysis caused it. Around the table, executives began whispering quietly. CFO Liam O'Connor, 51, leaned forward and scanned the document. 2 board observers were sitting silently along the wall. This wasn't just a team meeting anymore. This was suddenly a reputational crisis. David kept talking, making sure the room understood exactly who he believed was responsible. This type of oversight is unacceptable, he said. Oversight. Interesting word choice. Because Elena knew something no one else in the room knew yet. This wasn't an oversight. And it definitely wasn't her mistake. Across the table, Sam's phone buzzed quietly. A message popped up from him to Elena. Why aren't you saying anything? Elena glanced at the message. Then typed 4 words. Just give it time. She hit send. Then she slowly closed the spreadsheet on her laptop. But the email stayed open. Right there on the screen. Timestamped. Documented. Impossible to misunderstand. Because 3 weeks earlier, Elena had already warned someone about the exact $2 million problem now being blamed on her. And that someone was David Whitmore. But David clearly didn't realize something yet. He thought he was controlling the narrative in that room. He thought the accusation would stick. What he didn't realize was that Elena had already done something very simple. She had saved everything. And 10 minutes after that meeting ended, something happened that made David Whitmore's confidence disappear instantly. The board called an emergency session. Margaret Chin, the 58-year-old chair of the board, walked into the room with a laptop in her hands. And the moment David saw what was on that screen, the color drained from his face. Because suddenly the story wasn't about a $2 million mistake anymore. It was about an email. And that email was about to change everything. Have you ever watched someone confidently blame the wrong person without realizing the proof already exists? Because that's exactly what was happening in that conference room. David Whitmore didn't know it yet. But the moment he pointed at Elena Ramirez and declared that the $2 million mistake was hers, he had already made the worst move possible. He said it in front of witnesses. Lots of them. The quarterly finance review meeting at North River Logistics wasn't a casual team check-in. It was one of the most important internal meetings of the quarter. Department heads attended. Senior analysts attended. And sometimes, like today, members of the board quietly observed from the back of the room. Which meant whatever happened in this meeting carried weight. Career-level weight. The screen at the front of the room still showed slide 17. Vendor contract projection. Below it was the number everyone was staring at. Negative $2,048,000. David clicked his presentation remote again, but he didn't change the slide. Instead, he turned toward Elena. Can you explain how this happened? He asked. The tone sounded professional on the surface. But the implication was clear. You caused this. All eyes moved back to Elena. Inside her head, the moment replayed quickly. 3 weeks earlier. David's office. The spreadsheet. The exact conversation. But Elena didn't say any of that. Not yet. Instead, she repeated the same calm answer. Understood. For a second, the room looked confused. Some executives expected an argument. Others expected panic. Instead, they got composure. That alone made the situation stranger. Across the table, Sam Patel leaned closer to his laptop, pretending to read something while actually watching Elena carefully. Sam had worked with Elena for 2 years. He had never seen her miscalculate anything remotely close to this scale. And apparently, he wasn't the only one thinking that. CFO Liam O'Connor slowly removed his glasses and tapped the printed report. When was the pricing model updated? He asked. A reasonable question. A simple question. But David answered before Elena could even open her mouth. Late last month, David said quickly. It appears the surcharge variables were entered incorrectly during the analysis phase. Notice the wording. Appears. Entered incorrectly. Analysis phase. Corporate language has a funny way of pointing fingers without saying it directly. But everyone in that room understood exactly what he meant. Analyst mistake. Which meant Elena. Sam glanced at her again. Still calm. Still quiet. Now here's something interesting. Most people, when falsely accused in front of senior leadership, react emotionally. They rush to explain. They interrupt. They try to defend themselves immediately. Elena did none of that. Instead, she slowly moved her laptop trackpad. Scroll. Click. Open. The email thread remained on her screen. She read the message again, even though she already knew every word inside it. Subject line. Contract pricing change, cost impact confirmation. Her original message was clear. Short. Professional. Direct. She had written, Hi David, confirming the updated fuel surcharge assumption increases projected contract cost exposure by approximately $2.04 million annually. Please confirm whether you'd still like this change implemented. That message had been sent 21 days ago. And David had replied only 7 minutes later. His response was even shorter. Approved. Implement immediately. That was it. No confusion. No ambiguity. Just approval. Elena had saved the email like she saved every important instruction. Not because she expected trouble, but because documentation is part of good financial practice. Now back in the conference room, CFO Liam flipped through another page of the report. Was this change reviewed before submission? He asked. Again, David answered first. It should have been, he said. But unfortunately, mistakes happen. Mistakes happen. That phrase landed heavily. Because the implication was clear again. Someone made a mistake. And that someone was sitting quietly halfway down the table. One of the board observers scribbled something in a notebook. And for the first time, Elena noticed something subtle. David looked relaxed. Almost too relaxed. He genuinely believed the situation was settled. From his perspective, the narrative was simple. There was a financial problem. He had identified the cause. And he had publicly addressed it. Case closed. But Elena knew something he didn't. Narratives only work when nobody checks the timeline. And the timeline was about to matter a lot. Across the table, Sam's phone buzzed again. He typed another quick message. Seriously, what's happening? Elena read it. Then typed back the same 4 words she sent earlier. Just give it time. Sam frowned at the screen. Give it time? For what? Meanwhile, David moved on with the meeting. He advanced the presentation to the next slide. But the tension in the room hadn't disappeared. It lingered like a question nobody had answered yet. After the meeting ended, executives began closing laptops and gathering documents. Conversations started quietly. Low voices. Concerned tones. $2 million tends to do that. But Elena stayed seated. Calm. Focused. Then she opened a new email window. Her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard. Recipient 1. Liam O'Connor. Chief Financial Officer. Recipient 2. Margaret Chin. Chair of the Board. Recipient 3. Corporate Legal Archive. Subject line. Documentation regarding contract assumption change. Then she attached the email thread. The one with the approval. The one with the timestamp. The one David Whitmore had completely forgotten about. Before hitting send, she paused for a moment. Not out of hesitation. Just certainty. Because she knew exactly what would happen next. Click. Send. The email left her outbox instantly. Sam watched her from across the table. What did you just do? He whispered. Elena closed her laptop slowly. You'll see, she said. And 10 minutes later, something happened that stopped the entire floor of the finance department. Margaret Chin walked into the conference area with a serious expression and a laptop already open. She didn't sit down. She didn't greet anyone. She simply looked around the room and said one sentence. We need everyone in the executive boardroom. Now. David Whitmore looked confused. But when his eyes moved to Margaret's laptop screen, his expression changed immediately. Because sitting at the top of that screen was the email he had sent 3 weeks earlier. And in that moment, David realized something that made his stomach drop. Elena hadn't argued in the meeting. She hadn't defended herself. She had simply waited. Because the real conversation was about to happen with the board. And this time, the evidence would be on the table. What happens when the story someone just told collides with the written record? Because in corporate environments, there's something more powerful than confidence. More powerful than authority. More powerful than the loudest voice in the room. Documentation. And right now, documentation was sitting on Margaret Chen's laptop. As the group walked down the hallway toward the executive boardroom, the mood felt completely different from the earlier meeting. Before, it had been a normal quarterly review. Now it felt like something else entirely. Serious. Quiet. Uncertain. David Whitmore walked a few steps ahead of everyone, his posture stiff but controlled. He still wore the same confident expression he had in the meeting. But if you looked closely, something had changed. His eyes kept flicking toward Margaret's laptop. Like he was trying to remember something. Or worse, trying to forget something. Inside the executive boardroom, everyone took their seats. This room was bigger than the finance meeting room. Longer table. Larger screens. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Normally, Elena only came in here a few times a year. Today, she sat near the middle of the table. Margaret Chin took the seat at the head. CFO Liam O'Connor sat to her right. David sat across from Elena. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. The silence itself felt like pressure building. Finally, Margaret opened the laptop in front of her. "Before we continue," she said calmly, "I'd like to clarify the timeline behind the vendor contract adjustment discussed earlier." Her voice was steady, controlled, but very direct. She looked toward David. "David, can you walk us through how the assumption change was approved?" It was a simple question, but everyone in the room knew it mattered. David nodded confidently. "Of course," he said. Then he leaned forward slightly, hands folded. "As I mentioned earlier, the surcharge adjustment appears to have been incorrectly applied during the analyst modeling stage." Again, the same phrasing. Carefully worded. Neutral sounding, but pointing in the same direction. Analyst stage. Which meant Elena. Across the table, Elena sat quietly. No reaction. No interruption. Just listening. Margaret nodded slowly as if considering the explanation. Then she turned the laptop screen toward David. "Thank you," she said. "Now I'd like you to look at this." The email thread filled the screen. Subject line at the top. Contract pricing change, cost impact confirmation. David's eyes moved across the message. First Elena's original email. Then his reply. The room was completely silent now. The words on the screen didn't require interpretation. Elena's message had been precise. She had written clearly that the change would increase cost exposure by approximately $2 million. Then came David's response. Approved. Implement immediately. 7 minutes later. David read the message once. Then again. His expression didn't collapse dramatically. It changed more subtly than that. The small signs people show when reality suddenly interrupts their plan. His shoulders stiffened. His jaw tightened slightly. Margaret spoke again. "Is this the adjustment you referenced in the meeting?" David cleared his throat. "Yes," he said carefully. "But the intention was to revisit the pricing once renegotiation discussions progressed." Margaret didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked toward Elena. "Elena," she said, "did you flag the cost exposure when this change was requested?" The room turned toward her again. This time the atmosphere felt very different from earlier. Elena nodded. "Yes," she said calmly. "It's explained in the email and the attached model." She reached forward and gently rotated her own laptop toward the center of the table. The spreadsheet appeared on the screen. Rows of projections. Fuel variables. Vendor cost structures. Highlighted cells showing the projected swing. From positive 1.3 million in savings to negative 2 million in exposure. Those figures were calculated immediately after the assumption update, Elena explained. And they were included in the attachment sent with the confirmation email. CFO Liam leaned closer to the screen. He examined the model quietly. Then he looked toward David. "David," he said, "why was this change implemented if the analysis clearly showed a loss scenario?" Another pause. David's answer came slower this time. "We anticipated renegotiating the fuel terms later in the contract cycle," he said. But that's not what had been presented in the meeting earlier. Earlier, the narrative had been different. Earlier, it had sounded like a modeling error. Margaret seemed to notice the same contradiction. She folded her hands on the table. "Just to clarify," she said, her voice still calm but noticeably firmer now. "In the earlier meeting you described this as an analyst oversight." David didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched just a little too long. Across the table, Sam Patel watched everything like someone watching a slow-motion accident. Because now the entire room could see the same thing. The timeline, the approval, the warning, and the contradiction. Margaret closed the laptop halfway. Then she said something that shifted the power in the room completely. "David," she said, "we're going to need a few minutes to review this internally." Then she added another sentence. "Would you mind stepping out while the board discusses it?" There it was. The moment. David looked around the table. For the first time since the meeting began, he didn't look confident. He looked uncertain. But he stood anyway. "Of course," he said. He gathered his papers slowly. Then he walked toward the door. Just before leaving, his eyes moved briefly toward Elena. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even accusation. It looked more like realization. Because suddenly he understood something very important. Elena hadn't stayed quiet earlier because she had nothing to say. She stayed quiet because she didn't need to argue. The record already existed. The door closed behind David. Inside the boardroom, Margaret reopened the laptop. Liam leaned back in his chair. Sam exhaled slowly. And Elena sat calmly, hands folded on the table. But here's the part no one outside that room knew yet. That email thread wasn't the only documentation Elena had sent. Because when she forwarded the message earlier, she included something else. Something that would make the situation much bigger than a single contract. And when the board opened the second attachment, the entire conversation changed. Let's be honest for a moment. Have you ever sent an email you completely forgot about, only to realize later that it came back at the worst possible time? Because that's exactly the situation David Whitmore was walking into. And the moment he stepped into the executive boardroom, something in the atmosphere felt different. Quiet. Controlled. Serious. The room itself was larger than the regular conference room. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out across the city's skyline. A long walnut table stretched across the center. At the head of that table sat Margaret Chin, 58 years old, board chair, former investment banker, and someone inside North River known for one particular habit. She didn't ask questions unless she already knew the answer. To her right sat CFO Liam O'Connor. His laptop was open, his expression unreadable. Elena and David entered along with a few other executives. No one spoke for a moment. The quiet stretched just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Then Margaret looked up. "Let's clarify something," she said calmly. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Everyone in the room leaned forward slightly. She turned her laptop around and slid it toward the center of the table. "David," she said, "can you walk us through the approval process for the contract assumption change?" Simple question. Straightforward. David pulled out a chair and sat down. From his perspective, this still looked manageable. He adjusted his jacket and spoke with confidence. "The change appears to have been introduced during the modeling phase," he said. "It seems there was a misunderstanding regarding the surcharge variables." Again with the same language. Appears. Misunderstanding. Modeling phase. But Margaret didn't respond immediately. Instead, she tapped the laptop keyboard once, then rotated the screen fully toward him. "Is this the misunderstanding you're referring to?" she asked. David leaned forward. And then he saw it. The email thread. Right at the top. Subject line. Contract pricing change, cost impact confirmation. He scanned the first message quickly. Elena's email. Her warning. Clear as day. Confirming the updated fuel surcharge assumption increases projected contract cost exposure by approximately $2.04 million annually. Then his eyes moved to the reply below it. His reply. Approved. Implement immediately. 7 words. 7 incredibly expensive words. For a moment, the room stayed completely silent. David blinked once. Then twice. You could almost see the memory reconnecting in real time. Because suddenly he remembered the conversation. The spreadsheet. The late-night email. The quick approval he probably barely thought about at the time. But what he hadn't expected was for that email to appear in front of the board. Margaret folded her hands. "David," she said calmly, "this appears to be your approval." No accusation. No raised voice. Just a statement. David straightened slightly. "Yes," he said slowly. "That looks like my response." The room remained quiet. Then Liam O'Connor spoke. "When Elena flagged the cost exposure, why did you instruct her to proceed?" David hesitated. Just briefly. But in rooms like this, even a 1-second pause is noticeable. "We expected to renegotiate the pricing after implementation," he said. The initial adjustment was meant to create leverage during vendor discussions. Now here's where the tension in the room shifted. Because the explanation raised a bigger question. Margaret leaned forward slightly. "If that was the strategy," she said, "why did you state in the earlier meeting that the error originated with Elena?" That question landed harder than the first one. David's eyes moved across the table briefly, then toward Elena, then back to Margaret. I was referring to the implementation, he said. There may have been a misunderstanding regarding the timeline of adjustments. Another careful sentence. But something about it didn't sit well with the room. Because the email showed something very clear. Elena had warned him. Specifically. In writing. And he had approved it. Elena had been sitting quietly the entire time. But now Margaret turned toward her. Elena, she said, when you sent this message, what were you expecting? Elena answered calmly. Confirmation, she said. And when you received it? Margaret asked. I implemented the change exactly as instructed. Direct. Professional. No emotion. Just facts. Liam scrolled further down the email thread. There were attachments. The spreadsheet. The cost projections. Every detail documented. This analysis clearly shows the loss scenario, Liam said quietly. Elena nodded. Yes. So the risk was known at the time, he said. Yes. Another silence settled over the room. But this one felt heavier. Because the situation had now shifted from a simple financial error into something much more serious. Representation. During a financial review meeting earlier that day, David had publicly blamed Elena for a mistake. But the documentation suggested something different. Something very different. Margaret closed the laptop slowly. Then she looked directly at David. Her tone remained calm. But there was no ambiguity left in her words. David, she said, we're going to need a few minutes to review this further. He nodded stiffly. Then Margaret added the sentence that changed the entire dynamic. I'm going to ask you to step out while the board discusses this. No one spoke. David sat still for a moment, then slowly pushed his chair back and stood up. As he walked toward the door, his eyes moved briefly toward Elena again. But this time his expression wasn't confident. It wasn't calm. It was something closer to realization. Because he had just understood something important. The email Elena sent wasn't just a warning. It was documentation. And documentation changes power in rooms like this. The door closed behind him. Inside the boardroom, Margaret looked back at Elena. Thank you for forwarding the documentation, she said. Elena nodded politely. But what Margaret didn't know yet, what almost nobody in that room knew yet, was that the email thread they had just reviewed was only part of the story. Because over the past year, Elena had noticed something odd about several financial decisions coming from David Whitmore. Patterns. Approvals. Assumptions that didn't quite add up. And, without really planning to, she had kept records of those too. Which meant the board wasn't just looking at one email anymore. They were about to discover something much bigger. And once they did, David Whitmore's $2 million accusation would look like the smallest problem in the room. What if the email that saved Elena's career also exposed something no one inside the company was supposed to notice? Because once the board saw that message, the story stopped being about a $2 million contract mistake. Now it was about a pattern. And patterns make executives very nervous. Inside the boardroom, the door had barely finished closing behind David Whitmore when the atmosphere shifted again. The tension didn't disappear. It intensified. Margaret Chin leaned back slightly in her chair and looked toward Elena. You forwarded this about 10 minutes ago, she said. Elena nodded. Yes. Was there a reason you chose to send it after the meeting? Margaret asked. It wasn't an accusation. It was curiosity. Elena answered honestly. Because the situation had just been described as an analyst error, she said. And the documentation showed otherwise. Across the table, CFO Liam O'Connor slowly exhaled. Good call, he muttered quietly. He turned his laptop toward Margaret and reopened the attachments from the email thread. The spreadsheet model appeared again. Rows of data. Vendor rate structures. Fuel surcharges. Projected contract margins. All of it clearly showing how the cost shifted the moment the assumption changed. Liam pointed at one column. Here, he said. This is where the adjustment was made. Margaret leaned forward. And the financial impact? She asked. Just over $2 million annually, Liam confirmed. Margaret nodded slowly. For a moment she didn't speak. Then she asked Elena a question that seemed simple but carried a lot of weight. Elena, in your experience, is it normal for assumption changes like this to be approved without further review? Elena considered the question carefully. Sometimes, she said. But usually if the financial swing is significant, we flag it during contract review. And you flagged it? Margaret asked. Yes. Which is why you sent the confirmation email. Yes. The room fell quiet again. But then Liam frowned slightly at his screen. Wait, he said. Margaret looked up. What is it? Liam clicked through the spreadsheet again. Something about this timeline is odd, he said. He scrolled through a few tabs. Then he opened a second file attached to the email. Elena, he said, this model references 2 earlier projects. Elena nodded. Yes. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Earlier projects? Elena took a slow breath. This was the part she hadn't planned to explain yet. But the board had already found it. The structure of the assumption change looked familiar, she said. How so? Margaret asked. Elena turned her laptop toward them and opened another file. 2 additional spreadsheets appeared. These are from 2 previous vendor negotiations last year, she explained. Liam leaned closer. What's the connection? He asked. Elena highlighted a section in the model. The same type of fuel surcharge adjustment was approved, she said. And the financial result? Negative exposure, Elena replied. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. How large? Elena hesitated for a moment. About 1.2 million in one case. Around 900,000 in the other. Liam leaned back in his chair slowly. Those were attributed to forecasting errors, he said. Elena nodded. That's what the report said. Now the silence in the room felt very different. This wasn't just about one email anymore. Margaret tapped the table lightly with her finger. Are you suggesting this situation has happened before? She asked. Elena shook her head carefully. I'm not suggesting anything, she said. I'm just showing the documentation. That answer hung in the air for a moment. Because technically it was true. She wasn't making accusations. She was presenting records. Liam rubbed his forehead thoughtfully. If the same type of assumption change created losses before, he said slowly, then why would we repeat the strategy? No one answered immediately. Margaret looked at Liam. I think we need audit involved, she said. Liam nodded. Agreed. He closed the laptop halfway and folded his hands on the table. Let's review the decision trail across all 3 contracts, he said. Approvals, projections, meeting notes, everything. Margaret turned back to Elena. One more question, she said. Elena nodded. When you forwarded the email earlier, did you include these additional files intentionally? Elena didn't hesitate. Yes. Margaret studied her expression. Why? Elena's answer was calm. Because when someone publicly assigns responsibility for a financial outcome, she said, it's important that the full context is visible. Liam gave a quiet half-smile. That's one way to put it. Another few seconds passed. Then Margaret closed the laptop completely. All right, she said. Here's what we're going to do. Her voice had the tone of someone making a decision. David remains outside while we initiate an internal review, she said. Liam nodded. I'll contact internal audit this afternoon. And legal should be aware as well, Margaret added. Sam Patel, who had been sitting quietly near the end of the table, finally spoke. So, what happens to the contract? Liam shrugged slightly. We renegotiate, he said. Operational problems are fixable. Then he added something more serious. Governance problems are not. That sentence lingered in the room. Because everyone now understood something important. The financial loss itself wasn't the biggest issue anymore. The bigger issue was how it had been explained. And who had been blamed. Margaret stood up. We'll continue this review over the next several days, she said. Then she looked toward the door where David had exited earlier. For now, she said quietly, let's bring him back in. But here's the part no one in that room knew yet. The internal audit that followed wouldn't just examine 3 contracts. It would uncover emails, approvals, meeting notes, and decisions stretching back nearly 2 years. And once those records were pieced together, the $2 million mistake that started this entire situation would turn out to be just the smallest piece of a much bigger problem. One that David Whitmore never expected anyone to notice. And when the board finally finished reviewing everything, someone's career at North River Logistics was about to end. Have you ever noticed how quickly a confident accusation can fall apart once the records start speaking? Because a week after that boardroom meeting, the story inside North River Logistics looked completely different from the one David Whitmore had told in that conference room. Remember how it started? One sentence. "This $2 million mistake is on you." 14 people heard it. Executives, analysts, even 2 board observers. In that moment, it sounded definitive. Final. Like the problem had already been solved. Find the person responsible. Move on. But what David didn't realize when he said those words was that